The blood-curdling crack of flesh meeting flesh echoed across the wooden platform of Steins Pass Depot, New Mexico, in 1878, causing Yates Xavier to halt mid-stride, his weathered hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver on his hip. Through the crowd of travelers waiting for the eastbound train, he spotted her, a woman with copper hair stumbling backward from the force of a man's blow, her small valise tumbling from her grasp and spilling its meager contents onto the rough-hewn boards. Nora Gordon pressed a trembling hand to her cheek where her husband Frederick's ring had left a crimson gash. She'd hoped leaving would be easier in a public place. She'd been wrong. The depot buzzed with activity, but no one moved to intervene as Frederick's face contorted with rage, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper she'd grown to fear more than his shouting. "You think you can just leave?" Frederick hissed, grabbing her wrist with punishing force. "After everything I've done for you?" Nora felt the familiar sensation of shame washing over her, that terrible mix of humiliation and fear that had become her constant companion in the 3 years of their marriage. She tried so hard to make it work, to be the wife he wanted, but nothing was ever enough. "Please, Frederick," she whispered, aware of the curious onlookers pretending not to watch. "Not here." His response was to twist her wrist harder. "You ungrateful, that's quite enough." The voice cut through the tense air like a knife, deep and steady. Frederick's head snapped up, his eyes finding the tall figure of Yates Xavier stepping through the crowd. The cowboy's face was calm beneath the shadow of his Stetson, but his eyes were hard as flint. Nora had never seen him before, a stranger, lean and trail-worn, with dust from the road still clinging to his denim and leather. "This doesn't concern you," Frederick snarled, his grip on Nora's wrist tightening. Yates didn't flinch. "When a man strikes a woman in public, it becomes everybody's concern." His voice remained even, but there was something in it that made several bystanders take a step back. "Let her go," Frederick laughed, a sound without mirth. "This is my wife, Cowboy. I suggest you move along before you get yourself hurt." In one fluid motion, Yates closed the distance between them. He wasn't the largest man Nora had ever seen, but there was a coiled tension in his movements that spoke of a man who knew how to handle himself. "Last chance," Yates said quietly. "Take your hands off her." Frederick's face flushed with anger. He released Nora's wrist only to draw back his fist, but Yates was faster. The cowboy caught Frederick's punch mid-swing, twisting the man's arm and driving him to his knees with a precisely applied force that spoke of years of hard-won experience. "I said that's enough," Yates repeated, his voice still unnervingly calm. Frederick howled in pain and indignation. "Do you know who I am? I'm Frederick Gordon. I own half the businesses in this town. And that gives you the right to treat your wife like this?" Yates asked, applying just enough pressure to make Frederick wince. "I don't care if you own the whole territory. No man raises his hand to a woman in my presence." The station master, a thin man named Wilkins who had been cowering in his office, finally emerged. "Mr. Gordon, please, perhaps we should arrest this man," Frederick demanded, struggling against Yates's hold. "He's assaulting me." Wilkins fidgeted nervously, his eyes darting between Frederick Gordon, indeed one of the most influential men in Steins Pass, and the dangerous-looking stranger. Nora felt the weight of every stare as she stood there, her cheeks stinging, her secret shame now laid bare for all to see. She had endured 3 years of Frederick's escalating cruelty behind closed doors, becoming expert at hiding bruises and explaining away injuries. Now, in the harsh light of day, she felt naked, exposed. "Madam," Yates said, his attention turning to her while maintaining his hold on Frederick. "Are you all right?" The simple question nearly undid her. When was the last time anyone had asked her that and actually cared about the answer? I was leaving him," she managed, her voice stronger than she expected. "I have a ticket for the eastbound train." Yates nodded once, understanding in his eyes. "Then I suggest you board, madam. Trains due any minute." Frederick renewed his struggles. "She's not going anywhere. Nora, don't you dare." "The lady's made her choice," Yates interrupted, his grip tightening until Frederick fell silent. "Station master, when's that train arriving?" Wilkins checked his pocket watch nervously. 5 minutes, sir. Perfect timing, Yates said. He looked at Nora, his expression softening slightly. Madam, your belongings. Nora quickly gathered her scattered possessions, stuffing them back into her valise with shaking hands. A handkerchief, a small leather-bound journal, a daguerreotype of her parents, long deceased. The meager savings she'd managed to hide from Frederick over the months. Not much to show for 3 years of marriage, but it was all she had. You can't do this, Frederick was saying, his voice rising in panic now. She's my wife, she has nowhere to go. I have my sister in St. Louis, Nora said, finding her voice again. I've written to her, she's expecting me. The distant whistle of the approaching train pierced the air, and Nora felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly took her breath away. Freedom was 5 minutes away. You'll regret this, Frederick spat, his gaze burning into hers. You're nothing without me, Nora, nothing. You'll come crawling back within a month. Yates shifted his weight, forcing Frederick to grimace in pain. That's not how you speak to a lady. The train's whistle sounded again, closer now. Passengers began to gather their belongings, moving toward the edge of the platform. Nora clutched her valise tightly, her heart pounding. This was her chance to escape, to start anew. Station master, Yates called. I believe this man needs to cool his temper. Perhaps the sheriff's office would be a good place for that. Wilkins hesitated, clearly torn. Mr. Gordon is a man who just assaulted his wife in front of 24 witnesses, Yates finished for him. I don't care if he's the territorial governor, the law's the law. The train rounded the bend, its massive iron form coming into view, belching smoke into the clear New Mexico sky. Nora felt dizzy with anticipation and fear. What if Frederick broke free? What if this stranger couldn't hold him? What if Sheriff Mills? Wilkins suddenly called out, relief evident in his voice. A barrel-chested man with a silver star pinned to his vest pushed through the crowd, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. What's the trouble here? Sheriff Mills asked, though his expression suggested he'd already formed a pretty clear picture. This drifter attacked me without provocation. Frederick said immediately, arrest him. Sheriff Mills looked to Wilkins, who cleared his throat nervously. Actually, Sheriff Mr. Gordon was. He struck Mrs. Gordon first. The gentleman intervened. The sheriff's weathered face hardened as he turned to Nora. That true, Mrs. Gordon. Nora felt the weight of Frederick's stare, the pressure of years of fear and intimidation. But she also felt something new, the steady presence of the stranger who had stood up for her when no one else would. Yes, she said clearly, lifting her chin despite the pain it caused her bruised face. My husband hit me. This man stopped him. The train was pulling into the station now, its brakes screeching as it slowed to a halt. Passengers began disembarking, creating confusion on the platform. Sheriff Mills nodded once. Mr. Gordon, I think you'd better come with me. This is outrageous, Frederick protested. She's my wife, and that doesn't give you the right to beat her, the sheriff replied evenly. He gestured to Yates. You can let him go, mister. I've got him now. Yates released Frederick, who immediately straightened his jacket with as much dignity as he could muster. You'll regret this, Sheriff, all of you. The sheriff took Frederick by the arm. Let's go cool off at my office, Mr. Gordon. As he led Frederick away, he paused beside Nora. Mrs. Gordon, do you want to press charges? Nora hesitated. The idea of a public trial, of having to face Frederick across a courtroom, made her stomach turn. But more than that, she knew his influence in Steins Pass ran deep. Even if she won, she would never be safe here. No, she said finally. I just want to leave. Sheriff Mills nodded, understanding in his eyes. Safe travels, then. As the sheriff led Frederick away, still protesting loudly, Nora turned to face the train, her future, her escape. Thank you, she said to Yates, who stood watching her with those calm, steady eyes. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't. No need for thanks, madam, he replied, tipping his hat slightly. No decent man could stand by and watch that. The conductor called for boarding, and Nora took a step toward the train, then paused. I don't even know your name. A ghost of a smile touched the cowboy's lips. Yates Xavier, madam, Nora Gordon, she replied, then corrected herself. Just Nora, I suppose. I won't be using his name anymore. Yates nodded. Safe journey, Miss Nora. She boarded the train with legs that felt like water, finding an empty seat by a window. As the train began to pull away, she saw Yates still standing on the platform, watching. On impulse, she raised her hand in a small wave. He touched the brim of his hat in response, and then the train picked up speed, carrying her away from Steins Pass, away from Frederick, away from the life she'd endured for too long. Nora leaned back in her seat, her hand going to the locket around her neck, the last gift from her mother, and the one possession she'd never let Frederick pawn or sell. Inside was a tiny portrait of her parents and a lock of her mother's hair. A reminder of love, real love, not the twisted version Frederick had offered. As the New Mexico landscape slid past her window, Nora allowed herself to think about the stranger Yates Xavier with his quiet strength and unwavering resolve. In a town where everyone had looked the other way for years, he alone had stepped forward. She wondered if she would ever see him again, then dismissed the thought as foolish. Their paths had crossed for a moment, nothing more. Still, she couldn't help feeling that something significant had shifted in her world today, beyond just her escape from Frederick. Something had awakened inside her, a spark of the person she used to be, before Frederick had systematically crushed her spirit. The train gathered speed, rushing eastward toward St. Louis, toward her sister Catherine, toward a new beginning. Nora touched her bruised cheek gently, wincing at the pain, but there was something else beneath the hurt, now a sense of possibility, of hope. For the first time in 3 years, Nora allowed herself to breathe deeply, freely. She was going home. Yates Xavier watched the train until it disappeared around the bend, taking with it the copper-haired woman whose courage had impressed him more than she probably realized. It took guts to leave everything behind, especially when leaving meant facing the unknown. He'd ridden into Steins Pass that morning with no particular destination in mind, just another dusty stop on his journey. He hadn't planned on staying more than a night or two, just long enough to rest his horse, restock supplies, maybe play a few hands of poker if he found a fair game. Now, though, he had a feeling his stay might be extended. Frederick Gordon wasn't the type to forget an insult, and Yates had delivered more than an insult. He'd humiliated the man in front of the whole town. There would be consequences, but Yates wasn't concerned. He'd weathered worse storms than the temper of a small town bully. He collected his saddlebags from where he'd dropped them when he intervened and headed toward the saloon across from the depot. He needed information, and saloons were always the best place to start. The Grand Western Saloon was like 100 others Yates had seen across the frontier, trying to look sophisticated with its painted sign and curtained windows, but betraying its rough nature with the weather-beaten boards and poorly patched bullet holes in the walls. Inside, the usual afternoon crowd of drifters, cowboys, and local men seeking escape from work or wives populated the tables. Yates ordered a whiskey and took it to a corner table with a good view of both the door and the rest of the room. Old habits died hard, and a man in his line of work didn't survive long without maintaining awareness of his surroundings. He'd barely taken his first sip when the bartender, a portly man with impressive whiskers, sauntered over. "Haven't seen you around before," the man said, wiping his hands on a none-too-clean rag tucked into his apron. "Just rode in," Yates replied, "and already making friends with Frederick Gordon," the bartender chuckled. "News travels fast in Steins Pass." Yates took another sip of his whiskey. "Wasn't trying to make friends." "Well, you succeeded there." The bartender extended his hand. "Vernon Hughes, I own this establishment." Yates shook it briefly. "Yates Xavier, you planning to stay long in our little town, Mr. Xavier?" "Hadn't decided yet." Vernon nodded sagely. "Well, if you are staying, you might want to watch your back. Frederick Gordon isn't used to being crossed, especially not in public. I'll keep that in mind." Yates's tone made it clear he wasn't overly concerned. That was his wife on the train, Nora. When Yates nodded, Vernon continued, "Pretty little thing. Too good for Frederick if you ask me, though nobody ever does. He brought her here as a bride about 3 years back. St. Louis girl, from what I heard. Educated, refined, not the usual sort you find out here." Yates listened, filing away the information. "He hit her before, in public," Vernon shifted uncomfortably. Not where folks could see, no, but there were rumors. Woman like that doesn't get clumsy enough to explain all those bruises if you take my meaning. And nobody did anything. Yates couldn't keep the edge from his voice. The bartender had the grace to look ashamed. Frederick owns the bank, the mercantile, and has stakes in the mines, man like that in a town like this. He trailed off, then shrugged. It's not right, but that's how it is. Not anymore, Yates said quietly. Not for her, at least. Vernon studied him curiously. You know her, before today, I mean. No, then why'd you step in? Most men would have minded their own business. Yates drained his whiskey. My father taught me there are some things a man can't ignore if he wants to go on calling himself a man. Vernon nodded slowly, a new respect in his eyes. Well, you're welcome here, Mr. Xavier, for what it's worth. Not everyone in town is in Frederick Gordon's pocket. He returned to the bar, leaving Yates to his thoughts. So Nora was from St. Louis, educated. That explained the dignity she'd maintained even in her humiliation. She'd seemed so out of place in the rough frontier town, like a delicate rose blooming impossibly in rocky soil. Yates pushed the thought away. The woman was gone, headed back to civilization where she belonged. His path lay elsewhere, though at the moment he wasn't entirely sure where. After 10 years of drifting, one town began to look much like another. The saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Mills entered, pausing to let his eyes adjust to the dimmer light inside. Spotting Yates, he made his way over. Mr. Xavier, he said, removing his hat. Mind if I join you? Yates gestured to the empty chair across from him. Sheriff. Mills settled his bulk into the chair with a sigh. Been a while since someone stood up to Frederick Gordon that way. Can't say I wasn't pleased to see it, though I'd appreciate if you kept that observation between us. How is he? Cooled down some. I let him go with a warning. At Yates's raised eyebrow, the sheriff continued defensively. Look, I know how it seems, but the law's complicated when it comes to husbands and wives. Not that complicated, Yates countered. Assault is assault, true enough, but without Mrs. Gordon pressing charges. Mills shrugged. Anyway, I didn't come to debate the finer points of the law. I came to warn you, Frederick's making threats. I've been threatened before. Not by a man with Frederick's resources and connections, Mills said seriously. He's wiring his lawyer in Santa Fe as we speak, claiming you assaulted him without provocation. Yates leaned back in his chair. There were 24 witnesses who saw what happened, and half of them work for Frederick in some capacity or owe him money. The other half are probably too scared to cross him. The sheriff ran a hand through his thinning hair. Look, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just telling you how things stand. You might want to consider moving on. Are you asking me to leave town, Sheriff? Mills held his gaze. I'm suggesting it might be the wiser course of action. Yates considered the man across from him. Sheriff Mills wasn't corrupt exactly, but he was a pragmatist, a man who understood the realities of power in a frontier town. And the reality was that men like Frederick Gordon held most of the cards. I appreciate the warning, Yates said finally, but I think I'll stay a while, the sheriff sighed. Your funeral. He stood, settling his hat back on his head. Just remember I tried to warn you. After Mills left, Yates ordered another whiskey, mulling over the situation. The smart play would be to saddle up and ride out, find another anonymous town to pass through. He had no ties here, no reason to stay and face whatever trouble Frederick Gordon might cook up. Except for the memory of copper hair and frightened eyes turning brave. Except for the satisfaction of having done the right thing for once instead of just passing by on the other side. No, Yates decided. He would stay, at least for now. He'd faced worse odds than an angry businessman with a bruised ego. Besides, he was curious to see what kind of town would let a man like Frederick Gordon flourish. As dusk settled over Steins Pass, Yates finished his drink and headed out to find lodging for the night. Tomorrow would come soon enough, and with it, whatever consequences his actions had set in motion. The eastbound train rattled through the night, its rhythmic clickety-clack lulling most passengers to sleep despite the uncomfortable wooden seats. But Nora remained awake, watching the dark landscape rush past, illuminated occasionally by the moon when it emerged from behind clouds. Her face throbbed where Frederick had struck her, a painful reminder of what she was leaving behind. But the pain was almost welcome now, a final insult that had pushed her to do what she should have done years ago. She thought about the cowboy, Yates Xavier, with his quiet strength and steady gaze. There had been something compelling about him, something that went beyond his timely intervention. He'd looked at her like she mattered, like her pain was important. After years of Frederick making her feel increasingly invisible, that simple acknowledgement had been powerful. A young woman across the aisle stirred, adjusting her sleeping child on her lap. She caught Nora's eye and smiled softly. "First time traveling alone?" she asked quietly. Nora nodded. "Is it that obvious? You have that look, excited and terrified at the same time." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Eliza Parker. This is my son, James." "Nora G." She stopped herself. "Just Nora." Eliza's eyes flickered to the bruise on Nora's cheek, now darkening to a deep purple, but she didn't comment. "Where are you headed?" "Just Nora, St. Louis. My sister lives there." "That's quite a journey from Steins Pass. I'm only going as far as Albuquerque myself." Nora touched her cheek self-consciously. "I needed a fresh start," understanding dawned in Eliza's eyes. "I left my husband in Denver 3 years ago," she said quietly, stroking her sleeping son's hair. "Best decision I ever made, though it didn't feel like it at the time." "Were you afraid?" Nora asked, her voice barely audible over the train's noise. "Terrified," Eliza confirmed, "but less afraid than I was of staying." They fell silent for a moment, two women connected by a shared experience that required no further explanation. "Does it get better?" Nora finally asked. Eliza's smile was genuine. "It does, not all at once, and some days are harder than others. But yes, it gets better. You're stronger than you know, or you wouldn't have left in the first place." Nora considered this. She'd never thought of herself as strong. Frederick had spent years telling her how weak she was, how dependent, how fortunate to have him. But maybe there was a different kind of strength in enduring, in surviving, in finally saying enough. "Thank you," she said simply. Eliza nodded, then yawned. "Try to get some sleep if you can." "It's a long way to St. Louis." As Eliza dozed off, Nora continued to stare out the window, but with lighter thoughts now. Maybe Eliza was right. Maybe she was stronger than she knew. She'd need to be, starting over at 23 with little money and fewer prospects. Catherine had always said she could come home if things didn't work out, but Nora had been too proud, too ashamed to admit her mistake in marrying Frederick. Her older sister had disapproved of the match from the start, warning Nora that Frederick's charming facade concealed a controlling nature. How right Catherine had been. The money in Nora's valise wouldn't last long, even with Catherine's help. She would need to find work, but doing what? Her education had prepared her to be a society wife, not a working woman. She could read and write well enough to perhaps secure a position as a schoolteacher, if any schools were hiring. Or perhaps work as a shop clerk, though those positions typically went to men, but these were problems for tomorrow. Tonight, she was simply grateful to be on this train, moving farther away from Frederick with every passing minute. She closed her eyes, letting the train's motion rock her toward sleep, toward St. Louis, toward freedom. Back in Steins Pass, Frederick Gordon paced his opulent study, a glass of bourbon clutched in his hand. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the minutes, but he paid it no mind. His focus was entirely on plotting his revenge against his ungrateful wife and against the insolent cowboy who had dared to interfere. "She'll come crawling back," he muttered to himself. "When she runs out of money, when she realizes how good she had it here." But even as he said the words, a seed of doubt took root. Nora had looked different today. There had been a determination in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. And that cursed cowboy had given her the opening she needed. Frederick drained his glass and poured another, wincing at the pain in his shoulder where Yates had twisted his arm. The humiliation burned far worse than the physical discomfort. To be brought to his knees in front of the entire town, it was intolerable. His lawyer would be arriving from Santa Fe the day after tomorrow. Together, they would ensure that Yates Xavier regretted the day he'd set foot in Steins Pass. And as for Nora, Frederick had connections in St. Louis. He could find her if he wanted to, but did he want to? The thought gave him pause. Nora had been a prize when he'd married her beautiful, educated, from a respectable family. The perfect ornament for a man of his standing. But she'd never fully submitted to his authority, always maintaining a core of resistance that had infuriated him. Perhaps he was better off without her constant disappointment. Still, the principle remained. She was his wife. She had no right to leave him to humiliate him this way. No, he decided. He would bring her back if only to save face after that. Well, he'd make sure she never considered leaving again. Frederick smiled grimly, already composing the telegram he would send to his associate in St. Louis in the morning. Nora might think she'd escaped, but she would soon learn otherwise. The dawn broke over Steins Pass, painting the dusty streets in hues of gold and rose. Yates rose early, a habit formed from years on the trail where the best time to travel was often before the heat of the day set in. He'd secured a room at the modest Arizona hotel, paying for a week in advance, despite his uncertainty about how long he'd stay. After a simple breakfast in the hotel's dining room, he headed to the livery stable to check on his horse. The dun gelding, named Copper for his distinctive coloring, nickered softly at Yates's approach. "Morning, old friend," Yates greeted, offering an apple he'd saved from breakfast. "Rested up," the stable hand, a lanky boy of about 16, approached as Yates checked Copper's hooves. "Fine horse you got there, mister. He's served me well," Yates agreed. "Been together 5 years now." "You the one who stood up to Mr. Gordon yesterday?" the boy asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Yates straightened. "News travels fast," the boy grinned. "Whole town's talking about it. Ain't nobody ever stood up to him like that before." "Maybe somebody should have," Yates said, returning to his inspection of Copper's right rear hoof. "My pa says Mr. Gordon's gonna run you out of town," the boy continued. "Says he's got the mayor and most of the town council in his pocket." Yates set down Copper's hoof and faced the boy. "Your pa might be right, but I'm not easily run off." "That's good," the boy said with surprising conviction. "My ma used to work for the Gordons, cleaning their house. She quit after she saw how Mr. Gordon treated his wife. Said she couldn't stomach it no more, even though we needed the money." Yates felt a renewed surge of anger at the confirmation of what he'd suspected, that Frederick's abuse of Nora had been a long-standing situation known to many in the town. "Your ma sounds like a woman of principle," the boy puffed up with pride. "She is, pa too. He says just cause a man has money don't make him better than anybody else. Your pa's a wise man. What's your name, son?" "Daniel, sir. Daniel Thompson." "Well, Daniel Thompson, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep an extra eye on Copper here while I'm in town. He's particular about who handles him." Daniel straightened his shoulders. "Yes, sir, I'll take special care of him." Yates slipped the boy a coin, which Daniel accepted with wide eyes. "That's too much for just looking after a horse. Consider it payment for information, then," Yates replied. "If you hear anything about Frederick Gordon's plans that might interest me, let me know." Daniel nodded eagerly. "I will. My pa works at the telegraph office. He hears all sorts of things." "Good man." Yates gave Copper a final pat and headed back to the street, considering his next move. He needed to get a better feel for the town and its dynamics. If Frederick Gordon was as influential as everyone suggested, Yates wanted to know exactly what he was up against. His years as a lawman before he'd handed in his badge and taken to drifting had taught him the value of intelligence gathering before confrontation. The town was coming to life now, shopkeepers opening their doors, women heading to the general store for supplies, men gathering at the smithy or the barber shop to exchange news and gossip. Yates walked slowly down the main street, taking in the details most travelers missed. Steins Pass wasn't large, maybe 500 souls at most, but it was prosperous enough, situated at a crucial junction where the stage-coach route met the railroad. Most buildings were wooden, with a few brick structures marking the more established businesses. The bank, he noted, was the most imposing edifice, with Gordon Banking and Trust emblazoned across its front in gold lettering. Beside the bank stood Gordon's Mercantile, equally well maintained, with a fresh coat of paint and large display windows showcasing goods that would be considered luxuries in most frontier towns. Yates peered inside, seeing fine fabrics, imported ceramics, and even a display of French perfumes items that would appeal to a woman of Nora's background and refinement. He continued his circuit of the town, noting the location of the sheriff's office, the small courthouse, the newspaper office for the Steins Pass Sentinel, and various businesses. Nearly half seemed to bear the Gordon name or had signs indicating they operated by appointment to Gordon Enterprises. "Quite the little empire," Yates murmured to himself. "Talking to yourself is the first sign of trouble," a feminine voice commented dryly. Yates turned to find a woman in her 40s watching him with amused green eyes. Her blonde hair was streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore a simple but well-made dress that marked her as neither poor nor ostentatious. "Just making observations," Yates replied. "About our local baron?" she asked, nodding toward the Gordon Mercantile. "I'm Dr. Julia Blackstone. I tend to most of the medical needs in Steins Pass." "A female doctor, that's unusual." Dr. Blackstone raised an eyebrow. "So is a cowboy who intervenes in domestic disputes." "I heard what you did yesterday. It's about time someone stood up for Nora." There was a challenge in her tone. One Yates recognized she was testing him, seeing if he'd dismiss her authority because of her gender, just as others had likely questioned his interference in what many would consider a private matter between husband and wife. "I'm not a cowboy," he corrected mildly, "and I'd do the same for any woman being mistreated." "I believe you would," she said, her expression softening slightly. "Walk with me. I'm heading to my office, and I have a feeling we might have matters to discuss." Curious, Yates fell into step beside her. Such as the fact that you've made an enemy of the most powerful man in the county and you might want to know what you're up against." She glanced at him. "Unless you're planning to ride out today." "Not just yet, Doctor." Blackstone nodded as if confirming a hypothesis. "I thought not. You don't strike me as a man who runs from trouble." They reached a modest building with Dr. J. Blackstone, physician and surgeon, painted on the door. Inside was a tidy waiting room with several chairs, and beyond that, a treatment room visible through an open door. "Coffee," she offered, moving to a small stove in the corner. "Thank you." As she prepared the coffee, Dr. Blackstone spoke over her shoulder. "I treated Nora Gordon 7 times in the past 3 years. Broken wrist, cracked ribs, numerous contusions, a dislocated shoulder that she claimed came from falling downstairs." Her voice was clinical but couldn't quite mask the underlying anger. "Each time I advised her to leave him." Each time she said she couldn't. Yates absorbed this information, his jaw tightening. "And the law did nothing?" "Sheriff Mills is a good man in most respects, but he's realistic about the limits of his power. Frederick Gordon could have him removed from office with a word in the right ear in Santa Fe." She handed Yates a cup of strong black coffee. "Besides, Nora never filed a complaint. Without that, Mills's hands were tied, legally speaking." "So everyone just watched it happen, Doctor." Blackstone's expression hardened. "Not everyone. I spoke to Frederick directly after the 3rd accident, told him I knew exactly what he was doing and that if Nora died under suspicious circumstances, I would ensure an autopsy was performed, regardless of his influence." She took a sip of her coffee. "He was more careful after that. The injuries were less severe, less visible, but they continued." "Yes," she set down her cup. "I'd given up hope that she'd ever leave. Then yesterday happened." She studied Yates with renewed interest. "What made you step in?" "Most men wouldn't have." Yates considered the question. It wasn't the first time he'd intervened in such a situation, though usually it had been in his official capacity as a lawman. "My mother died from injuries inflicted by my stepfather when I was 12, he said finally. "I was too young, too small to stop him. By the time I was old enough to fight back, it was too late for her." He met Dr. Blackstone's gaze steadily. "I don't stand by anymore," understanding and a new respect filled her eyes. "I see." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What happened to your stepfather?" "He had an unfortunate accident while cleaning his shotgun. At least that was the official finding." Dr. Blackstone didn't press further. Frederick won't forgive what you did. He's a proud man and you humiliated him publicly. He'll come after you. I expected as much. You should also know that he's likely to go after Nora as well. His pride won't allow her to simply walk away. This gave Yates pause. She's heading to St. Louis to her sister. He'd follow her that far. He has business connections throughout the territory and beyond. It wouldn't be difficult for him to have someone meet that train. She leaned forward. Nora's strong in ways that might not be obvious, but she's been under his control for years. If he sends someone persuasive enough. The implication was clear. Nora might be convinced or coerced into returning. What's her sister's name? Yates asked, making a quick decision. Catherine, I believe. Catherine Gooding. Her husband is a professor at Washington University. Yates nodded, committing the information to memory. Thank you, doctor. You've been very helpful. What are you going to do? She asked as he rose to leave. First, I'm going to send a telegram. Then, I'm going to wait for Frederick Gordon to make his move. Dr. Blackstone smiled grimly. He won't keep you waiting long. Yates left the doctor's office with a clearer picture of both the situation and his next steps. He needed to warn Nora that she might still be in danger, which meant contacting her sister in St. Louis. After that, he'd deal with Frederick Gordon. At the telegraph office, he found Daniel's father, a serious man with the same lanky build as his son. Yates composed a brief message to be sent to Professor William Gooding at Washington University in St. Louis. For Catherine Gooding, stop your sister Nora en route from Steins Pass. Stop husband. May attempt to intercept. Stop. Advise caution upon her arrival. Stop. Regards, Yates Xavier. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to put Catherine and her husband on alert. Assuming the telegram reached them in time, and assuming they took it seriously. As Daniel's father calculated the cost of the telegram, Yates noticed a familiar figure through the window. Frederick Gordon himself, striding purposefully down the street toward the telegraph office, accompanied by another man in an expensive suit who could only be the lawyer from Santa Fe. How soon can this go out? Yates asked, keeping his voice casual. Next batch in about 20 minutes, Mr. Thompson replied. I'd appreciate if it went sooner. It's urgent. Yates placed extra money on the counter. Mr. Thompson glanced outside, noticing Frederick's approach. His expression hardened. I'll send it right now, Mr. Xavier. Thank you. Yates moved toward the door, timing his exit to coincide with Frederick's arrival. The two men came face to face on the wooden walkway outside the telegraph office. Frederick's face flushed with anger at the sight of Yates, while his companion, the lawyer, assessed Yates with cold calculation. Mr. Gordon, Yates said evenly, tipping his hat. Beautiful morning. Frederick's hands clenched at his sides. You won't think it's so beautiful when you're sitting in a territorial prison for assault. Yates kept his expression neutral. Interesting perspective. I seem to recall events differently. Witnesses will confirm that you attacked me without provocation, Frederick said, his confidence returning as he gestured to his companion. This is Mr. Hargrove, my attorney. He's prepared to file charges against you today. Mr. Hargrove, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetual frown, inclined his head slightly. Mr. Xavier, I suggest you leave town immediately. If you do so, my client might be persuaded to show leniency. Yates smiled thinly. That's very generous, but I believe I'll stay. Steins Pass is growing on me. Frederick's face darkened. You're making a mistake. Not the first one, probably won't be the last. Yates stepped aside. Don't let me keep you gentlemen. I'm sure you have important business to conduct. As Yates walked away, he heard Frederick hiss to his lawyer, I want him gone, Hargrove, whatever it takes. Yates continued down the street, his posture relaxed but his senses alert. He'd made his position clear. He wasn't intimidated and he wasn't leaving. Now he would wait to see how Frederick responded. He didn't have to wait long. Nora's journey to St. Louis took 5 days, with transfers and layovers that tested her newfound independence. Each mile that passed put distance between her and Frederick, but didn't entirely dispel her fear. She'd lived too long under his shadow to believe escape could be so simple. Still, as the landscape changed from the arid Southwest to the greener, more populous regions of Missouri, Hope began to take root. She made conversation with fellow travelers, practiced asserting herself with conductors and station agents, and gradually felt her confidence returning, the confidence Frederick had systematically destroyed over the years of their marriage. When the train finally pulled into St. Louis Union Station, Nora gathered her meager belongings with trembling hands. What if Catherine wasn't there? What if her telegram had never arrived? What if Nora? The familiar voice cut through the noise of the crowded platform. Catherine, 5 years older than Nora and as sensible as ever, pushed through the crowd, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Oh, Nora," Catherine gasped as she reached her sister, taking in the fading bruise on her cheek. Without another word, she pulled Nora into a fierce embrace. Nora clung to her sister, the emotion of the moment of finally being safe, of being with family who loved her overwhelming her composure. Tears streamed down her face as she allowed herself to be held. "It's all right now," Catherine murmured, stroking Nora's hair. "You're home, you're safe." When they finally separated, Catherine held Nora at arm's length, examining her closely. "Are you hurt anywhere else? Should we see a doctor?" Nora shook her head. "No, I'm fine, just tired." Catherine didn't look convinced but didn't press the issue. "William is waiting with the carriage." "Let's get you home." As they made their way through the station, Catherine kept a protective arm around Nora's shoulders. "We received the strangest telegram yesterday," she said. "From someone named Yates Xavier. He warned us that Frederick might try to prevent you from reaching us." Nora stopped in her tracks, stunned. "Yates sent you a telegram. You know this person?" Catherine asked, her brow furrowing in concern. He's the man who helped me leave when Frederick tried to stop me at the depot." Nora's mind whirled with this new information. Yates had cared enough to warn her sister, to ensure she reached safety. "I don't understand. Why would he do that?" Catherine squeezed her shoulder gently. "We can discuss it at home." "William was concerned enough that he arranged for a friend from the police department to meet your train, just in case." Nora glanced around and noticed a uniformed officer standing discreetly nearby, watching the crowds. The realization that Frederick might have sent someone after her sent a chill down her spine. "Let's go," she agreed, suddenly eager to be away from the public space of the station. William Gooding waited with their carriage, his scholarly face breaking into a warm smile at the sight of his sister-in-law. "Nora, thank God you're safe." The ride to the Goodings' comfortable home in a respectable neighborhood near the university was filled with cautious conversation. Catherine and William were clearly bursting with questions but restrained themselves, focusing instead on making Nora feel welcome and secure. It was only after dinner, when they were settled in the cozy parlor with tea, that Catherine finally broached the subject they'd all been avoiding. "Nora, dear," she began gently, "I know this is difficult, but we need to understand what happened. The telegram from this Mr. Xavier was rather alarming." Nora cradled her teacup, drawing comfort from its warmth. "It's a long story. We have time," William said kindly. So Nora told them everything, how Frederick's charming courtship had given way to controlling behavior almost immediately after their wedding. How the first time he'd struck her had been 6 months into their marriage, followed by tearful apologies and promises it would never happen again. How the incidents had escalated in both frequency and severity over the years. How she'd finally gathered the courage to leave, only to have Frederick confront her at the depot if Yates hadn't intervened. She shuddered at the memory. Frederick was so angry. "I think he might have dragged me home by force." Catherine's face had grown progressively paler throughout the story. "Oh, Nora, why didn't you write to me? Tell me what was happening." "I was ashamed," Nora admitted. "You warned me about him and I didn't listen, and then, I don't know. Frederick isolated me so gradually. He raided my mail, controlled who I spoke to. Eventually, it seemed easier to endure than to fight." William, who had remained silent throughout most of Nora's story, finally spoke. "This Mr. Xavier, he stood up to Frederick publicly." "That's quite remarkable, given what you've said about your husband's influence in Steins Pass." "Yates didn't seem concerned about consequences," Nora said, a hint of admiration creeping into her voice. "He just did what was right." Catherine and William exchanged a look that Nora couldn't quite interpret. "What?" she asked. Catherine hesitated. "It's just, for him to send us a telegram warning us about potential danger to you, that seems to go beyond a stranger's simple good deed." Nora felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "I'm sure he would have done the same for anyone." "Perhaps," Catherine said, not sounding convinced. "In any case, we're grateful to him, and you're safe now, that's what matters." But even as her sister spoke the reassuring words, Nora couldn't help wondering if she was truly safe. Frederick wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily, and if Yates had been concerned enough to send a warning to St. Louis. "I should write to Yates," she said suddenly, "to thank him and to let him know I arrived safely." "That seems appropriate," William agreed. "I'll help you draft a telegram in the morning." Later that night, in the comfort of the guest bedroom that would be hers for as long as she needed it, Nora sat at the small writing desk and began a letter. A telegram seemed too brief, too impersonal for what she wanted to express. "Dear Mr. Xavier," she wrote, then crossed it out. Too formal. "Dear Yates," she tried again, the unfamiliar intimacy of using his first name making her pause, but she continued. "I have arrived safely in St. Louis and am with my sister and brother-in-law who received your telegram. Words cannot express my gratitude for your intervention at the depot and for your continued concern for my welfare. In a world where most people looked away, you chose to act. I shall never forget your kindness. I hope this letter finds you well and that my husband's anger has not caused you undue difficulty. Please know that your actions have given me a chance to rebuild my life, and I intend to make the most of this opportunity. With deepest thanks, Nora." She read over the letter several times, wondering if she had said too much or too little. There was so much more she wanted to express: her admiration for his courage, her curiosity about what kind of man would risk himself for a stranger, her hope that he had left Steins Pass and was safe from Frederick's vengeance. But in the end, she sealed the letter as it was. Catherine would help her find Yates's location tomorrow so it could be sent. For now, she would rest, secure in the knowledge that she was among people who cared for her, far from Frederick's reach, or so she believed. In Steins Pass, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. True to his word, Frederick Gordon had filed assault charges against Yates, producing 3 witnesses who claimed Yates had attacked Frederick without provocation at the train depot. Sheriff Mills had been forced to issue an arrest warrant, though he'd warned Yates privately before doing so, giving him a chance to leave town. Yates had declined the opportunity, instead surrendering himself peacefully at the sheriff's office. "This is a mistake, Xavier," Mills said as he reluctantly locked the cell door. "Gordon's got Judge Wilson in his pocket. You won't get a fair trial here." "Maybe not," Yates agreed calmly, settling onto the narrow cot, "but running would only confirm my guilt in people's eyes." Mills shook his head in exasperation. "What do you care what people here think? You're a drifter. Tomorrow you could be 3 counties away, free as a bird." Yates didn't respond directly. "Has there been any news from St. Louis about Mrs. Gordon?" "Nothing I've heard," Mills replied. But the telegraph operator Thompson mentioned that Frederick sent several wires to contacts in Kansas City and St. Louis right after you left his office that day. Yates nodded, unsurprised. He could only hope his warning had reached the Goodings in time. "Your trial's set for Monday," Mills continued. "That gives us 3 days to figure something out." "Us?" Mills looked uncomfortable. "Look, I know what really happened at that depot, so does half the town. What Gordon's doing, it ain't right. But you're still locking me up." "I'm following the law," Mills countered. "For now," he lowered his voice. "But that doesn't mean I can't help level the playing field a bit." Before Yates could ask what he meant, the sheriff turned and left, leaving Yates alone with his thoughts. The cell was small but clean, with a cot, a washstand, and a small barred window that looked out onto the alley behind the sheriff's office. Yates had been in worse places. He just settled back on the cot when he heard a soft tapping at the window. Looking up, he saw Daniel Thompson's face peering through the bars. "Mr. Xavier," the boy whispered urgently. "Pa sent me. He says to tell you that Mrs. Gordon arrived safely in St. Louis. Her sister met her at the station." Relief washed over Yates. "Thank you, Daniel. That's good news." There's more, Daniel continued. Pa says Mr. Gordon received a telegram this morning that made him real angry. He was shouting about incompetent fools and such. Pa thinks whoever Gordon sent to intercept Mrs. Gordon must have failed. This was even better news. Your pa's taking a risk sharing this information, Daniel grinned. Pa says some risks are worth taking. Oh, and Dr. Blackstone says to tell you she's working on something that might help your case. Tell them both I'm grateful. I will. I gotta go before someone sees me. Daniel hesitated. Mr. Xavier, half the town's talking about what's happening. Not everyone's on Mr. Gordon's side. With that encouraging thought, the boy disappeared. Yates lay back on the cot, processing this new information. Nora was safe in St. Louis, beyond Frederick's immediate reach. That was the most important thing. As for his own situation, he'd face that when the time came. He wasn't alone, which was something of a novelty. In his years of drifting, Yates had made a point of avoiding entanglements, keeping to himself, moving on before connections could form. It was simpler that way, less complicated, less painful, but here in Steins Pass, he'd somehow managed to acquire allies in the space of just a few days. People willing to take risks on his behalf. People who believed in doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy or safe. It was a strange feeling, not entirely unwelcome. Monday morning dawned bright and clear in Steins Pass. The courthouse, a modest brick building on the town square, was filled to capacity for Yates's trial. It seemed the entire town had turned out to witness the proceedings. Judge Wilson, a heavy-set man with an impressive beard and a perpetual scowl, presided. Frederick Gordon sat at the prosecutor's table with his lawyer, Mr. Hargrove, both looking confident and composed. Yates, lacking funds for counsel, represented himself, a fact that seemed to please Frederick greatly. Sheriff Mills escorted Yates to his place at the defense table, removing the handcuffs before stepping back to his position against the wall. The sheriff's expression was carefully neutral, but Yates caught the slight nod of encouragement. Court is now in session, the clerk announced. The territory of New Mexico versus Yates Xavier on the charge of aggravated assault. Judge Wilson banged his gavel. Mr. Hargrove, you may present your opening statement. Hargrove rose, smoothing his expensive suit. Your Honor, the facts in this case are clear and straightforward. On the afternoon of May 15th, my client, Mr. Frederick Gordon, a respected businessman and pillar of this community, was saying goodbye to his wife at the train depot. She was traveling to visit family. During this private moment between husband and wife, the defendant, a drifter, unknown in this town, violently assaulted Mr. Gordon without provocation or justification. He went on to paint a picture of Frederick as the innocent victim of a random attack, promising to present witnesses who would confirm this version of events. Throughout the statement, Frederick nodded solemnly, the very picture of an aggrieved citizen seeking justice. When Hargrove concluded, Judge Wilson turned to Yates. Mr. Xavier, your opening statement. Yates rose slowly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Hargrove's theatrical presentation. Your Honor, I won't waste the court's time with fancy speeches. The truth is simple. Frederick Gordon was physically assaulting his wife at the train depot. I intervened to stop that assault. Any force I used was the minimum necessary to prevent him from further harming Mrs. Gordon. Murmurs swept through the courtroom at this direct contradiction of Hargrove's narrative. Frederick's face flushed with anger while Judge Wilson banged his gavel for order. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Xavier, the judge warned. Do you have evidence to support it? I have witnesses, Your Honor. Witnesses who will contradict the statements of 3 respected citizens, Hargrove interjected. Drifters and troublemakers, no doubt. The court will determine the credibility of witnesses, Mr. Hargrove, Judge Wilson said, though his tone suggested he was inclined to agree. Proceed with your first witness. The trial unfolded as Yates had expected. Hargrove called his 3 witnesses, all employees of Frederick Gordon, who testified with remarkable similarity that they had seen Yates attack Frederick without provocation. Under Yates's cross-examination, they maintained their stories despite several contradictions in details, clearly well rehearsed. When it was Yates's turn to present his defense, he called Daniel Thompson's father first. "Mr. Thompson, what is your occupation?" Yates asked. "I run the telegraph office here in Steins Pass." "And were you present at the depot on the afternoon in question?" "I was," Thompson confirmed. "I was sending some commercial telegrams for the station master." "Can you tell the court what you saw?" Thompson straightened his shoulders. "I saw Mr. Gordon strike his wife across the face, hard enough to knock her back and cut her cheek. Then I saw Mr. Xavier here intervene to stop him from hitting her again." Frederick leapt to his feet. "That's a lie." "Mr. Gordon, control yourself," Judge Wilson admonished, though without much force behind it. He turned to Thompson. "Mr. Thompson, you understand the seriousness of testifying under oath." "I do, Your Honor, and I'm telling the truth." "Mr. Gordon hit his wife and Mr. Xavier stopped him. That's what happened." Hargrove rose for cross-examination. "Mr. Thompson, isn't it true that your employment at the telegraph office depends on business from Gordon Enterprises?" "Yes, and isn't it also true that you were recently reprimanded by Mr. Gordon for delays in processing his telegrams?" Thompson's face tightened. "That has nothing to do with what I saw. Answer the question, please." "Yes, there was a disagreement about service priorities." "So you have a personal grudge against my client," Hargrove concluded smugly. "That's not, no further questions." Yates called Dr. Julia Blackstone next, who testified about treating Nora Gordon for injuries consistent with domestic abuse over the past 3 years. Hargrove objected strenuously that this was irrelevant to the specific incident at the depot, and Judge Wilson sustained the objection, instructing the jury to disregard the testimony. As the morning wore on, it became increasingly clear that the proceedings were skewed in Frederick's favor. Judge Wilson consistently ruled against Yates's objections while sustaining Hargrove's. The jury, composed largely of men with business ties to Gordon Enterprises, looked unmoved by the defense's witnesses. During the midday recess, Sheriff Mills approached Yates in the holding room behind the courtroom. "It's not going well," he said without preamble. "I've been in tighter spots," Yates replied, though in truth, he was beginning to doubt his strategy of facing the charges head-on. "There's a horse saddled behind my office," Mills said quietly. "Fast animal, could get you to the territorial line before sundown." Yates raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting I escape, Sheriff?" Mills looked uncomfortable. "I'm suggesting that sometimes the law and justice don't align as neatly as they should." Before Yates could respond, the door opened, and the court clerk announced it was time to return to the courtroom. Mills gave Yates a meaningful look before leading him back to the defense table. The afternoon session began with Hargrove calling his final witness, Frederick Gordon himself. Frederick took the stand with the confident air of a man accustomed to deference, swearing the oath with solemn dignity. Under Hargrove's gentle questioning, he recounted a version of events that portrayed Yates as the aggressor and himself as the bewildered victim of an unprovoked attack. He expressed concern for his fragile wife, suggesting that the stress of the incident might have confused her into believing he had struck her. "Nora has always been delicate," Frederick said, his voice dripping with false concern, "prone to confused thinking when upset. I've consulted specialists about her condition. The performance was masterful," Yates had to admit. Frederick played the role of concerned husband perfectly. When Hargrove concluded his questioning, Yates rose for cross-examination, aware that this might be his last chance to reveal the truth. "Mr. Gordon, you've testified that you never struck your wife at the depot. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Frederick replied smoothly. "Have you ever struck her?" On any occasion, Frederick's expression hardened slightly. "My relationship with my wife is private, Mr. Xavier." "Please answer the question." "No, I have never struck my wife." Yates nodded as if accepting this answer. "Mr. Gordon, are you familiar with Dr. Julia Blackstone?" "She's the local physician, yes." "Are you aware that she has treated your wife for numerous injuries over the past 3 years? Injuries consistent with physical abuse." Frederick's composure slipped momentarily. "Dr. Blackstone is mistaken or lying. Nora is clumsy. She falls 7 times in 3 years." resulting in broken bones and severe contusions. Objection, Hargrove interjected. This line of questioning is irrelevant and designed to prejudice the jury. Your Honor, Yates countered, Mr. Gordon's treatment of his wife is directly relevant to establishing the truth of what occurred at the depot. Judge Wilson frowned. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Mr. Xavier. Yates returned his attention to Frederick. Mr. Gordon, if your wife were to testify about the events at the depot, what do you think she would say? A flash of anger crossed Frederick's face. As I said, Nora is confused easily. She might believe any number of things that aren't true. Is that why you sent telegrams to contacts in Kansas City and sent Louis immediately after she left? To find her and bring her back before she could speak freely about how you treated her? Frederick's face drained of color. That's how did you answer the question, Mr. Gordon? Frederick regained his composure. I was naturally concerned for my wife's welfare, traveling alone in her fragile state. So concerned that you instructed your men to intercept her by force if necessary? Objection, Hargrove shouted. Counsel is making unfounded accusations. Sustained, Judge Wilson ruled immediately. Mr. Xavier, restrict your questions to facts and evidence. Yates nodded, changing tack. Mr. Gordon, you've stated that I attacked you without provocation. Yet multiple witnesses have testified that you struck your wife first, and I only intervened to protect her. Are all of these witnesses lying? They must be confused about what they saw, Frederick insisted, or they have reasons to testify against me. Just as your witnesses have reasons to testify for you, Frederick's eyes narrowed. My witnesses are respected members of this community, who also happen to be financially dependent on you, Yates pointed out. Before Frederick could respond, the doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. Every head turned to see Sheriff Mills escorting a woman into the courtroom, a woman with striking copper hair and determined green eyes. Nora Gordon had returned to Steins Pass. Frederick's face went from pale to crimson in an instant. What is the meaning of this? He demanded. Nora walked steadily down the center aisle, her gaze fixed on the judge. She wore a simple but elegant traveling dress, and though she was clearly nervous, there was a newfound confidence in her bearing that hadn't been there when Yates last saw her. Your Honor, she said in a clear voice that carried throughout the now silent courtroom, I understand you're conducting a trial regarding events that directly involved me. I would like to testify. Judge Wilson appeared flustered by this unexpected development. Mrs. Gordon, this is highly irregular. The prosecution has already completed its case. She's my wife, Frederick interrupted, rising from the witness stand. She's confused, unwell, she shouldn't be here. Nora's gaze finally shifted to Frederick, and there was no fear in her eyes, now only determination. I am perfectly well, Frederick, and I am here to tell the truth. The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs. Judge Wilson banged his gavel repeatedly for order. Your Honor, Yates said when the noise subsided, I request permission to call Mrs. Gordon as a rebuttal witness. Judge Wilson looked to Hargrove, who was in frantic whispered consultation with Frederick. Finally, the lawyer straightened. Your Honor, we object to this late addition of a witness who has clearly been influenced by the defendant. That's not true, Nora said firmly. I've had no contact with Mr. Xavier since leaving Steins Pass. I came back of my own accord when my sister received word of this trial. Judge Wilson stroked his beard, clearly weighing his options. On one hand, Frederick Gordon's influence was substantial. On the other, denying testimony from the primary witness to the alleged assault would look suspicious, especially with so many townspeople watching. I'll allow the witness, he ruled finally. Mrs. Gordon, please take the stand. Frederick was forced to step down, his face a mask of barely controlled fury as he passed Nora. You'll regret this, he hissed under his breath. Nora didn't flinch. She took her place on the witness stand, was sworn in, and turned expectantly to Yates. Mrs. Gordon, he began, please tell the court what happened at the train depot on the afternoon of May 15th. Nora took a deep breath. I was leaving my husband. I had purchased a ticket to St. Louis and was waiting for the eastbound train. Frederick discovered my plans and confronted me at the depot. When I refused to return home with him, he became angry and struck me across the face. She touched her cheek, where a faint yellowish mark was still visible. His ring cut my skin. I was stunned, and my belongings scattered across the platform. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. Mr. Xavier stepped forward and told Frederick to stop. When Frederick refused and prepared to strike me again, Mr. Xavier restrained him using only enough force to prevent him from hitting me. At no point did Mr. Xavier attack my husband without provocation, as has been claimed. "Thank you, Mrs. Gordon," Yates said. "Can you tell the court why you were leaving your husband?" Nora's eyes briefly met Frederick's, and for the first time she didn't look away from his anger. "Because for 3 years he has been physically abusing me." The incident at the depot was not the first time he had struck me, merely the first time he did so in public. The courtroom was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on Nora as she recounted, with simple dignity, the pattern of abuse she had endured. She described Frederick's controlling behavior, his rages, the escalating violence, and her multiple attempts to appease him in hopes of changing his behavior. "I believed I had no choice but to stay," she concluded. "Until that day at the depot, when Mr. Xavier showed me that someone was willing to stand up to Frederick. That gave me the courage to leave." Yates had no further questions. Hargrove rose for cross-examination, his confidence visibly shaken. "Mrs. Gordon," he began, attempting to regain his authoritative tone, "isn't it true that you have a history of emotional instability?" Nora met his gaze steadily. "No, Mr. Hargrove, I do not. Yet your husband has consulted specialists about your condition." "My husband told people I was unstable to explain away my injuries and to discredit me if I ever spoke out about his abuse," Nora replied. "It is a common tactic of abusive men, as I've since learned." Hargrove tried several more angles of attack, but Nora remained composed and consistent. Her testimony was devastating to Frederick's case, and everyone in the courtroom knew it, including Judge Wilson, who was now faced with a difficult decision. Rule against Frederick Gordon and potentially lose his position, or disregard compelling testimony and risk public outcry. After Nora stepped down, both sides presented closing arguments. Hargrove's was notably subdued compared to his opening, while Yates simply asked the jury to consider all the evidence honestly and render a just verdict. Judge Wilson instructed the jury and sent them to deliberate. To everyone's surprise, they returned after only 20 minutes. "We find the defendant, Yates Xavier, not guilty of the charge of aggravated assault," the foreman announced. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Frederick stormed out with Hargrove in tow, his face contorted with rage. Judge Wilson banged his gavel one final time and quickly retreated to his chambers, no doubt already composing his letter of resignation. As the crowd dispersed, Yates made his way to Nora, who was surrounded by well-wishers, including Dr. Blackstone and the Thompsons. "Thank you for coming back," Yates said when he finally reached her side. "You didn't have to do that." Nora smiled, and it transformed her face, erasing years of fear and sorrow. "Yes, I did. You risked everything to help me. I couldn't let you face the consequences alone, Doctor." Blackstone cleared her throat. "Not to interrupt this touching reunion, but Frederick won't take this defeat lightly. Either of you. It might not be safe for you to remain in Steins Pass." Nora nodded. "I know. I'm returning to St. Louis tomorrow. My sister and her husband have helped me file for divorce. I'll be staying with them until it's finalized." Yates felt an unexpected pang at the thought of her leaving again so soon. "That's probably wise." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words and questions. "Doctor." Blackstone, perceptive as always, took the others with her, leaving Yates and Nora alone in the now empty courtroom. "I received your telegram," Nora said, "warning my sister. That was thoughtful of you." "I was concerned," Yates admitted. "Frederick isn't a man who gives up easily." "No, he isn't." Nora studied Yates's face. "Why did you stay in Steins Pass? You must have known Frederick would come after you." Yates considered the question. The honest answer was one he was only beginning to acknowledge to himself. "I couldn't leave knowing he might send someone after you. I needed to make sure you were safe." a man you'd never met before that day at the depot. Some things transcend acquaintance, Mrs. Gordon. Nora, she corrected gently. And yes, I suppose they do. She hesitated, then asked, what will you do now? It was a question Yates had been asking himself. The path that had seemed so clear for years, drifting from town to town, avoiding attachments, suddenly felt less appealing. I haven't decided yet, Nora nodded, understanding in her eyes. Well, if your travels ever bring you to St. Louis. She left the invitation unspoken but clear. I've heard it's a fine city, Yates said, a smile tugging at his lips. It is. Nora returned the smile, full of opportunities for a man with your sense of justice. Before Yates could respond, Sheriff Mills entered the courtroom. Sorry to interrupt, but there's some commotion at the Gordon house. Might be trouble. Yates and Nora exchanged concerned glances. What kind of trouble? Yates asked. Neighbors reported shouting, breaking glass. Sounds like Frederick's taking his defeat hard. We should check on him, Nora said, surprising both men. He's dangerous when he's like this. Are you sure that's wise? Yates asked. He's not your responsibility anymore. Nora straightened her shoulders. No, but I won't have anyone else hurt because of me. Besides, she added with a hint of steel in her voice, I'm not afraid of him anymore. The three of them hurried to the Gordon mansion, an imposing structure on the outskirts of town. As they approached, they could hear the sounds of destruction from within, glass shattering, furniture being overturned, incoherent shouting. Sheriff Mills drew his revolver. Stay behind me. They entered the house to find a scene of chaos. Frederick had systematically destroyed the parlor, smashing everything in sight. He stood in the center of the destruction, a bottle of whiskey in one hand, a revolver in the other. Frederick, Sheriff Mills called firmly, put down the gun. Frederick's head snapped up, his eyes wild and unfocused until they fixed on Nora. You, he snarled, this is all because of you. No, Frederick, she replied calmly, this is because of you, your actions, your choices. You humiliated me, he shouted, gesturing with the gun. You think you can just walk away, that I'll let you destroy everything I've built? Yates moved slightly, positioning himself to shield Nora if necessary. The movement caught Frederick's attention, and his rage found a new target. And you, he spat at Yates. The hero, the White Knight. You think you've won, you think it's over? It's over, Frederick, Nora said, her voice steady despite the danger. The truth is out now, everyone knows what you are, Frederick's face contorted. I built this town, I am this town, they'll forget your lies soon enough. Put down the gun, Gordon, Sheriff Mills ordered again. Don't make this worse. Frederick laughed, a hollow, desperate sound. Worse? How could it be worse? My wife has turned against me. The town will follow. Everything I've worked for is still yours, Nora interjected. Your businesses. Your money, your position. All I want is my freedom. Something flickered in Frederick's eyes, a moment of clarity amidst the rage and whiskey. Freedom, he repeated, almost to himself. You were never supposed to be free. You were supposed to be mine. No person can belong to another, Frederick, Nora said gently. That's not love, that's possession. Frederick stared at her for a long moment, swaying slightly on his feet. Then, with a sudden movement that made everyone tense, he raised the gun and tossed it onto a nearby chair. Get out, he said, his voice suddenly weary. All of you, get out of my house. Sheriff Mills moved forward cautiously, retrieving the discarded weapon. I think you should come with me, Mr. Gordon. Sleep it off in a cell. Frederick didn't resist as Mills took his arm. As the sheriff led him past Nora and Yates, Frederick paused, his eyes meeting Nora's one last time. I did love you, he said, something almost like regret in his voice. In my way, Nora nodded. I know, but it wasn't enough. Outside, as Mills escorted Frederick to the jail, Nora released a shuddering breath. It's really over. Yates studied her face in the fading light. Are you all right? Yes, she said, and he believed her. For the first time in years, I think I truly am. They walked back toward town in companionable silence, the events of the day settling around them like dust after a storm. At the hotel where Nora had taken a room for the night, they paused. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. Yates tipped his hat. It was my honor, Mrs. Nora. She smiled at his correction. Will you see me off at the station tomorrow? I will. As Nora turned to enter the hotel, she looked back over her shoulder. Mr. Xavier Yates, have you ever been to St. Louis? Can't say that I have. Perhaps it's time you broadened your horizons, she suggested, a hint of playfulness in her voice that he suspected had long been buried under fear and oppression. I hear it's lovely in the summer. With that, she disappeared inside, leaving Yates on the walkway with a smile tugging at his lips and thoughts of St. Louis filling his mind. The following morning, Yates met Nora at the train station, her single valise packed and ready for her journey back to St. Louis. The platform was considerably less crowded than it had been the day of her original departure, but those present gave her respectful nods and warm greetings, a stark contrast to the averted gazes of before. It seems your testimony changed more than just the outcome of my trial, Yates observed. People don't like to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, Nora replied, but once they're forced to, many find their conscience again. Dr. Blackstone arrived to say goodbye, embracing Nora warmly. You're a braver woman than most, Nora Gordon. Your story has already inspired others. Martha Jenkins came to see me this morning about her husband's temper. Nora's eyes widened. Really, is she? She's safe for now, and knowing she's not alone has given her courage. The doctor squeezed Nora's hands. You've started something important here. The train whistle sounded in the distance, signaling its approach. Dr. Blackstone embraced Nora once more, then tactfully moved away, giving her and Yates a moment of privacy. So, Nora said, suddenly shy, this is farewell again. For now, Yates agreed, but perhaps not for long. Hope flickered in Nora's eyes. You're considering St. Louis, then? I'm considering a great many things I hadn't thought possible a week ago. The train rounded the bend, steam billowing dramatically as it approached the station. Passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to board. I should give you this, Yates said, pulling an envelope from his vest pocket. My direction, should you wish to write. I'll be moving on from Steins Pass soon, but the postmaster in Santa Fe can forward correspondence. Nora took the envelope, her fingers brushing his. I will write, she promised, and I hope. Yes, she met his eyes directly. I hope you'll answer, and that someday those answers will come from closer than Santa Fe. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and hissing steam. Passengers began disembarking, creating the familiar bustle of activity. You should board, Yates said, reluctant to end their conversation but aware of the train's schedule. Nora nodded, picking up her valise. She hesitated, then impulsively leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to Yates's cheek. Thank you, she whispered, for showing me that good men still exist in this world. Before he could respond, she turned and boarded the train, finding a seat by the window where she could see him on the platform. Yates touched his hat in salute as the train began to pull away, carrying Nora back to St. Louis, back to the new life she was building, a life free from fear and abuse. But not, perhaps, a life he would remain absent from. As the train disappeared around the bend, Yates felt a curious lightness. For the first time in many years, his path forward seemed illuminated by possibility rather than shadowed by the past. St. Louis was eastward, and he had typically drifted west or south in his travels. But directions could change. Patterns could be broken. New beginnings could arise from the most unexpected encounters. 3 months later, Nora Gordon, soon to be Nora again, once her divorce was finalized, sat in her sister's garden, reading. The late summer heat had finally broken, leaving St. Louis pleasantly warm rather than stifling. She had settled into a new routine, helping Catherine with household management in the mornings, volunteering at a women's shelter in the afternoons, and reading or writing letters in the evenings. The shelter had been Catherine's suggestion. You understand what these women are experiencing better than most, she had pointed out. Your perspective could be invaluable. Initially reluctant, Nora had found unexpected healing in helping others escape situations similar to what she had endured. Each woman who found the courage to leave an abusive situation reinforced Nora's own decision and helped diminish the lingering shame that still occasionally surfaced. Her divorce proceedings were progressing smoothly, despite Frederick's initial attempts to contest. His influence didn't extend to St. Louis, and Nora's testimony, coupled with Dr. Blackstone's sworn statement about her injuries over the years, had convinced the judge to grant the petition. Soon, she would legally be Nora again, free of the Gordon name and all it represented. She had written to Yates twice since returning to St. Louis. The first letter had been somewhat formal, thanking him again for his assistance and describing her safe arrival and warm reception by her sister. The second, sent after receiving his reply, had been more personal, sharing her experiences at the shelter and her hopes for the future. His responses had been equally measured at first, but his second letter had revealed more of the man behind the quiet strength she had witnessed in Steins Pass. He wrote of his past as a lawman in Wyoming, his decision to resign his badge after becoming disillusioned with the politics of law enforcement, and his subsequent years of drifting. He mentioned almost casually that he was considering a more settled existence, perhaps even a return to law work in the right circumstances. Nora had read between the lines, hope blossoming in her heart. Was he considering St. Louis? He hadn't said so directly, but the implication seemed clear. "Nora," Catherine called from the house, interrupting her thoughts. "There's someone here to see you." Curious, Nora set aside her book and rose, smoothing her skirts. They weren't expecting visitors, and her circle of acquaintances in St. Louis remained small. Perhaps it was Mr. Thornton, her lawyer, with news about the divorce. She entered the parlor and stopped abruptly, her heart skipping a beat. Standing by the fireplace, hat in hand, was Yates Xavier. He looked different from when she'd last seen him. His clothes were newer, his hair trimmed, his face freshly shaven, but his eyes were the same, steady and warm as they met hers. "Mr. Xavier," she breathed, unable to hide her surprise and delight. "You're in St. Louis." "Miss Nora," he replied, a smile tugging at his lips. "I believe you mentioned it was lovely in the summer." Catherine, watching this exchange with interest, discreetly excused herself, closing the parlor doors to give them privacy. "Your last letter mentioned you were considering a more settled existence," Nora said, moving farther into the room. "I didn't realize your considerations had brought you east. Neither did I until recently." Yates set his hat on a side table, his movements deliberate and measured as always. "I received an interesting offer from an old colleague. The St. Louis Police Department is expanding its detective bureau. They're looking for men with experience." "And you have experience," Nora said, remembering his mention of law work in Wyoming. "Some," he acknowledged. "Enough that they've offered me a position." Joy bubbled up within Nora. "You're staying in St. Louis, if the city agrees with me." His eyes held hers. Early indications are promising. The double meaning wasn't lost on her. "I've always found St. Louis to be a welcoming place for new beginnings," she said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "New beginnings," Yates echoed, taking a step toward her. "That's what I'm hoping for, Nora. A chance to put down roots after years of drifting, a chance to build something lasting." The air between them seemed charged with possibility. Nora had never expected to feel this way again, this flutter of anticipation, this hopeful uncertainty. After Frederick, she had assumed that part of her was dead, the capacity for romantic feeling destroyed by years of abuse and fear. But here it was, awakening like a dormant seed finally receiving sunlight and water. Here was a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and treated her with nothing but respect and kindness. A man who had risked himself to help her when she needed it most, who had followed up to ensure her safety, who had, perhaps, crossed half a country with her in mind. "I think," she said carefully, "that St. Louis could be exactly what you're looking for." Yates smiled then, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face. "I believe you may be right." In the months that followed, Nora and Yates built their relationship with the careful deliberation of two people who understood the value of what was growing between them. Yates settled into his new position with the Detective Bureau, earning the respect of his colleagues with his methodical approach and unwavering integrity. Nora continued her work at the women's shelter, eventually taking on a paid position as its administrator. Her divorce was finalized 6 months after her return to St. Louis, legally freeing her from Frederick Gordon and the painful chapter of her life he represented. The day the final papers arrived, Yates took her to dinner at one of the city's finest restaurants to celebrate. "To new beginnings," he toasted, raising his glass to hers. "To freedom," she countered, "and all its possibilities." As winter gave way to spring, their courtship progressed naturally, without pressure or haste. Yates, understanding the shadows of Nora's past, was careful never to rush her or make her feel constrained. Nora, in turn, gradually opened herself to trust again, to believe that love could be gentle and respectful rather than controlling and painful. They were married the following summer in the garden of Catherine and William's home, with a small gathering of friends and family. Dr. Julia Blackstone traveled from Steins Pass for the occasion, bringing news that Frederick Gordon had sold most of his businesses and left town shortly after Nora's departure, his influence diminished by the public revelation of his true nature. "The women of Steins Pass send their thanks," Julia told Nora during the reception. "Your courage changed things, made it possible for others to speak out." Nora squeezed her hand. "It wasn't just my courage, it was Yates's intervention that made it possible." "A partnership from the beginning," Julia observed with a smile, "as the best marriages are." The newlyweds made their home in a comfortable house not far from Catherine and William, close enough for frequent visits, but with the privacy to build their own life together. Yates continued his work with the police department, earning promotions that eventually led to his appointment as chief detective. Nora expanded the women's shelter into a full-fledged aid society, providing not just refuge but legal assistance, employment training, and child care for women seeking independence from abusive situations. Their first child, a son named Thomas, was born 2 years after their wedding, followed by a daughter, Elizabeth, 18 months later. Their home became a haven of love and security, filled with laughter and warmth that both Nora and Yates had once believed might be forever beyond their reach. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch swing of their home, watching their children play in the twilight, Yates took Nora's hand in his. "You ever think about that day at the depot?" he asked. "How differently things might have gone if our paths hadn't crossed?" Nora leaned her head against his shoulder, considering. "I might never have found the courage to leave, or Frederick might have forced me back." She shuddered slightly at the thought. "I'm grateful every day that you were there." "I'm the grateful one," Yates said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Finding you gave my life purpose again, direction." "We saved each other then," Nora concluded, watching Thomas help his little sister up after a tumble, his small face serious with responsibility. "And now we're building something neither of us thought possible." "Something worth fighting for," Yates agreed. "Worth crossing a country for." As dusk deepened into night, they called the children in for bed, maintaining the comfortable routine they had established. Later, after stories had been read and goodnight kisses given, Nora and Yates returned to the porch, sitting side by side in the peace of a summer evening. "I love you," Nora said softly, the words still a marvel to her even after years of marriage. "Not just for what you did that day, but for who you are every day since." Yates drew her close, his arms the safest place she had ever known. "And I love you for your courage then and your strength now, in the gentle darkness of a saint." Louis night, far from the dusty platform of Steins Pass Depot, they held each other close, two souls who had found in each other not just rescue, but redemption, not just safety, but joy. Their story, begun in a moment of crisis and courage, continued to unfold in the countless quiet moments of a life built together, day by day, choice by choice, love by love. And in the end, it was not just the dramatic moment of intervention that had saved Nora, nor the brave testimony that had freed Yates, but the daily decision to choose kindness over cruelty, respect over domination, and love over fear that built their lasting happiness. A happiness neither had dared to imagine on that fateful day when she was beaten by her husband at the depot, and the cowboy saw it and ended it right there.